This is the goat meat blind taste test video presentation for Trey Ehrhardt and Thomas Liese. So for this experiment, the objective was to see how goat compared to beef and pork in a blind taste test. And some facts about goat consumption in the U.S. Goat is not as widely consumed as the U.S. as it is in other parts of the world. And also, because of that, it is not as widely produced in the U.S. And at the end of 2012, there were only about 2.6 million goats produced in the U.S., as opposed to 29 million beef cows produced at the end of 2012. And also, the demand for goat meat has increased in some markets in the southeastern United States because it is often served in specialty dishes centered at festival or holiday events. And consumption for goat meat fluctuates also with religious affiliations of the ethnic groups whose staple meat is goat. And also demand increases significantly during Christian holidays such as Easter and Christmas and Muslim holidays. And for the experiment, we used a blind taste test. The reasoning for this was to minimize or eliminate any preconceived notions or opinions about the different meats that were being used in the experiment. And again, it was a blind taste test, so the participants did not know what meats they were trying. They did not know that it was goat, beef, and pork. And we also randomized various parts of the experiment. Such as the containers that were used for the meat and the way that the meat was served. And with that, the meat was served in little plastic cups that were labeled with squares, triangles, and circles. And they were also color-coded. So they were red, green, and blue, and they had a corresponding survey of the same color. And so in a blue survey might have triangle equals goat, square equals cow, and circle equals pork. While a red survey might have triangle equals pork, square equals goat, and circle equals cow. And here we have an example of the different cups that were used to label to identify the meat: circle, square, and triangle. And again, that was so they would just know it as those shapes, and they wouldn't know it as beef, pork, or goat. And here we have a participant actually filling out the survey while doing the taste test. And so the description of our sample, the location was at the SST Software Campus in Stillwater, Oklahoma. The date was October 29th, 2015, and the time was 11 a.m. to about noon or 12:30 p.m. And we used this sample because it consisted mostly of working adults that we would be able to get high participation. And the participants were recruited by Dr. Bailey Norwood. And we had 34 total participants, and they all had at least a bachelor's degree, if not higher. Some of the strengths of our sample were that the participants did not have to travel because this was at their workplace, so they would just have to get up from their office, walk down the hallway to one of the rooms where we were conducting the taste test, spend about 10 minutes filling out and participating in the taste test, and then they were free to go back to work. And also, the participants had no prior involvement in this experiment, and they did not know what meats they were trying, so they were not biased at all. One of the biggest weaknesses of the sample was that it was not very diverse. It was mostly white and mostly male. The statistics for the participants were that all but one of the participants were white, that's about 97%, and 28 out of the 34 participants were male, about 82%. And according to the 2010 U.S. Census, only about 72% of the U.S. population is white, and only about 49.2% of the U.S. population is male. So our sample was skewed more towards white and male. And and here we see, again, mostly white male participants. We did have a few female participants. And next for the results, what we found is that participants did not notice a major difference between goat meat and beef and pork. And for coming up with the different satisfaction ratings. We had 9 satisfaction ratings on the survey, ranging from dislike extremely to like extremely, and we assigned numerical values to each of those. So dislike extremely would have a numerical value of 1, while like extremely would have a numerical value of 9. And then we use those numbers to construct our graphs and charts. And so our first one was flavor satisfaction. And they were all three of the meats were rated very similarly, and there was very little difference between them. There was a 12.8% difference between beef and goat, and a 4% difference between pork and goat. For juiciness satisfaction, they were even more similar for this rating. There was only a 6% difference between beef and goat, where beef was favored just slightly more. There was only a 4% difference between pork and goat, where pork was just favored just slightly more. And then for overall satisfaction, again, they were very similar, not a whole lot of difference. Beef, and there was a 12.9% difference between beef and pork, where beef was favored more, and an 8% difference between pork and goat, where pork was favored more. And also what we found that was kind of interesting was that goat was rated the most consistently throughout all 3 of these satisfaction ratings, while pork varied the most throughout these 3 satisfaction ratings, even though pork is consumed much more widely in the United States than goat is. And then we also calculated the distinctness of each of the meats. This was one of the questions on the survey that the participants were asked to answer. And based on those results, we found that 48% of the participants listed pork as the most distinct, 28% listed beef as the most distinct, and 24% listed goat as the most distinct. So goat was the least distinct meat out of the 3. And then, in summary, as we said earlier, goat meat is not as widely consumed in the United States as beef or pork, so it is not as widely produced. And that's just simple supply and demand. There's not as big a demand for goat meat, so there's not as big of a supply of goat meat. And again, the blind taste test was the best format to use for this experiment because it eliminated most of the bias, any bias that the participants would have, because again, they didn't know what the mystery meats were that they were trying. And also, our sample was not representative of the general U.S. population. Again, it was skewed towards white and male. Again, there was 97% of the participants were white, whereas only 72% of the U.S. population is white, and 82% were male, whereas only 49.2% of the U.S. population is male. And our blind taste test results demonstrated that goat meat is more preferable than popular belief in the United States. And then we also have our works cited page for the research that we did for the introduction. Thank you, that's it.